Well, we've just come down here to what I think is my soul place. This is the Seven Creeks, and this place changed my life. This is a window of what it was like in 1770. Seven Creeks, a granite creek, beautiful water flowing over granite boulders and rocks, full of trout, cod and macquarie perch. So this is how it once was. This was the last place in Victoria that actually contained trout cod. And the interesting part of the story is that they weren't native to this section of the Seven Creeks. They were found up to the base of a waterfall about a kilometre that way, up to the 1920s. And above that waterfall, there were no large native fish, only blackfish and minnows. And in the 1920s, the Strathbogie Angling Club collected trout, cod and macquarie perch from below that waterfall and from the Goulburn River at Cathkin, about 50 kilometres that way, and released them into the creek here, and they established. The irony of it all is that when trout cod disappeared everywhere else in Victoria, they hung on in this creek. And so when trout cod were finally separated as a distinct species from Murray cod in 1972, everybody thought, right, this was their typical habitat, these mountain upland streams like the Seven Creeks. Then the thinking did a 180 reversal back in the 1980s. It was discovered that there was still trout cod living in the Murray River between Yarrawonga and Cobram. And the scientific community then decided, well, Seven Creeks was an aberration. They weren't native to this section of the creek. They were introduced. So the Murray River represents the ultimate habitat for trout cod. That did not gel with what the anglers had said in the past. The anglers had said, yes, they were in the Murray River, but they were in the mountain streams almost up to the snow line. So we ended up with this polarised view. Where were trout cod found originally? Were they an upland fish or a lowland fish? And that was the primary question that the project tried to answer. So one point that needs to be clarified is, what is upland or lowland? Well, Murray-Darling Basin Authority came up with a model based on the Murrumbidgee River, and they've classified the Murrumbidgee River upstream 700 metres above sea level as what's called montane habitat. And montane habitats tend to be alpine in nature, they tend to have a low gradient, the rivers and streams are boggy, start off as a chain of ponds. The next habitat zone is what's called upland, and on the Murrumbidgee it goes from about 700 metres, which is round about where Micalago is, down to about where Burrinjuck Dam is, about 400 metres. And typically in upland habitats, the rivers plunge out of the mountains down through rocky ravines and gorges, and they have a steep gradient. Next you come to what's called the slope zone, and that in the Murrumbidgee was from about Burrinjuck down to Wagga. Here the gradient starts to ease, and you start to see the appearance of billabongs alongside the river, though the river still runs through a fairly confined sort of gorge with a reasonable gradient. So typically, as you went from montane to upland rivers, the bottom of the rivers was basically rock. When you got down to the slope zone, it became gravel and coarse sand. And finally, the last type of habitat zone is what's called the lowlands, and that's where the rivers run through a very extensive floodplain. Low gradient, sand, silt and clay dominates the riverbed. So they're quite distinctive types of habitat, and the Murray-Darling Basin Authority uses altitude as a definition. When you come south in Victoria, the altitudes tend to be lower because of the steeper gradient. When you go north of the Murrumbidgee, the zones appear at higher altitudes because the country is more elevated. But it's a pretty useful system of classifying habitats. So ultimately, what did I learn about trout cod? Which model was right, the upland model or the lowland model? And the answer is they were both in part correct. there's good evidence that trout cod were abundant in the Murray River down to about Barmer, and in the Murrumbidgee River downstream to about Narrandera. And they were found even further downstream. They went down to South Australia. But they were very patchy. There were places they were common, there were places where they were less common. The evidence points to that, yes, places like Wonga and Yarrawonga, Wagga Wagga, those places trout cod were abundant, but they remained abundant well upstream. So if you went upstream to Tintoldra in the Murray River, trout cod were abundant. If you went in the Goulburn upstream to Eildon, they were clearly abundant. And yet they went even further upstream. They went into the uplands through Canberra, up to Jamison in the Goulburn River, the top of the Lachlan River, Bathurst, and they even punched their way up into the Montane zone. There's good records of trout cod being around Cooma and being quite common. So they were a fish that were adapted to a lot of habitats, and the prime things seem to be they like water of strong velocity. They like running water, and that's why they weren't common in some areas of the lowlands. They weren't a fish that liked big stagnant holes like Murray cod. The second thing is they seem to be better adapted to cooler additions than Murray cod. They breed earlier, they bite longer in the winter, that's what all the anglers say. So there's obviously an adaptation that suits them better to higher altitudes than Murray cod. The answer is, if I had to pick the type of habitat that was the ultimate for trout cod, it was the slopes habitat. Large rivers like the Goulburn, like the Murrumbidgee between Burrinjuck and Wagga Wagga, that's trout cod heaven, and all the evidence points to that. But I don't think we should blinker our view that that was the only sort of habitat they were in. They were in small creeks like the Seven Creeks back in the early days too. So I think stereotyping any animal is not wise, but the conclusion is, I think prime trout cod habitat was demarcated by the Hume Highway. Even though I live in Cairns these days, when I come back here I'm rejuvenated. I've been coming to this place since I was a young boy, so it's very special to me.